This is one video in a series about how different species are aquacultured. This one we're focusing on macrophytes, which is a word often used for macroscopic algae, which a lot of people would call seaweed. One thing that you might not realize is that a lot of these algae have a life cycle that involves sort of two stages: a very small organism called a gametophyte, meaning that's where they actually make their gametes that do sexual reproduction, that makes the egg and sperm, and then the sporophyte, which gives rise to the larger individuals that you would actually recognize if you saw an algae. So this is an example of kelp. This is a brown algae. Here's a picture of it, the way that people might use it for cooking in a stew or to make kelp chips. And kelp is very big, and we'll see a picture of what this looks like in real life. But there are a lot of different ways of growing it, often on lines that are submerged and allowed to grow in the water. This particular species that they're talking about here grows from November to July, but there are a lot of places where certain species flourish in the winter and others flourish in the spring. And so it's not uncommon for somebody who's involved in kelp aquaculture to have two different species that they're maintaining so that they have product twice a year. That's really important. Another type of seaweed that we enjoy is wakame, which is what is used in a lot of the seaweed salads you might get. It looks like that when you are growing it. And so again, it grows on lines or on a hard substrate. And something to notice is that when we are developing it in the lab from small organisms, before it's ready to go out into the wild, the young sporophytes, the little tiny plants, the thalli, actually get grown on a rope. And so that's why a lot of this is the larger plant growing on the rope. And so you'd see that up here too. The little seedlings indoors in a lab, in a culture facility, or in a greenhouse are growing on a piece of rope. Finally, this is another type of situation where we're growing algae. This is actually porphyra, and that is the algae that gives us nori, or the wrapper for a lot of the sushi that people like to eat. It's a very, very thin, fragile algae, and so when it is grown on the rope, it's put onto little nets, and so it has a lot more of, the rope is interconnected so that it can support this very fragile algae, and you'll see a picture of that over here. So let me scroll down to the porphyra. We have some people in, I believe this is in Korea, doing porphyra aquaculture. And you can see here's the netting, the organisms to grow on, and this is what it looks like when it's alive and is growing. It's a red algae, even though when you eat it, it looks very brown. And so the net will be connected and kept in an environment where the water flows in and out, lots of nutrients, etc., but not terribly deep. So at low tide, workers can go out and fix things, or you can use a boat to pull the nets in ultimately. So in tropical regions, especially tropics and subtropics, especially in Southeast Asia, although this one is also is Africa, you can see a lot of places can do pretty large scale but low tech seaweed aquaculture in very shallow, warm waters, especially in bays. And so this is where you'll see people growing the algae that's needed for something like carrageenan or agar production, because you need huge volumes, but the product that you get out of it is not super expensive. And so this isn't something that you would see growing in a lot of more industrialized countries because the profit margin is very, very low. What we're seeing much more of these days in the US, in Europe, is kelp aquaculture. So this is sugar kelp, which is very common in New England, which is where I am. It is used both for food and it's seen as a management tool for nutrient uptake and for carbon sequestration. And so a lot of people are looking to kelp aquaculture for some of its environmental benefits as well as a product that can be brought to market. We were talking before about carrageenan, and this is an example of a type of algae that produces a lot of carrageenan. This is Capophycus is the genus, and in order to get the product out of this that we would use in toothpaste, in cookies, in low-calorie ice cream and things like that, it has to be washed, it has to be processed with a lot of substances. Either they're using potassium chloride or an alcohol to separate out the carbohydrates, which would then be used later on and dried and made into a powder form, which is how somebody would buy carrageenan to use in their products. And so this large, well, that's probably like a foot across, that could give you very little of the actual carrageenan when it's finally dried, which is why you need huge plants, lots of volume, and for the labor and the input of materials and processing, that's why it's not so common to find people doing that outside of places like Southeast Asia, because it's such a low, it's labor intensive and volume intensive, and so that would make the cost really hard in places like the US. And I mention this because I've heard of projects where people tried to start to do this in the US and then had to abandon it because they couldn't even make enough money to pay their laborers.